I really love making cartoon backgrounds. I love looking at them, and honestly, I love drawing them way more than characters. But I have to admit, I'm not exactly the best draftsman. I can defend myself when it comes to vector stuff in Inkscape, but when it comes to complex backgrounds, I just can't really draw that well. Lately, I've been wanting to change that, so I started practicing and pushing myself more and more. And I came up with a system to make studying easier and more fun. I called it Explorative Copy, and I made a video about it. Link in the description. In this video, I wanted to experiment with the Explorative Copy method, but this time apply it to an entire background to see if it translates well to a full illustration, and if you can really learn using it. I want to see how well it works, and for that I'm going to do an experiment where I study an illustration from a professional cartoon show, and then use what I learned to create a brand new background, keeping a similar style and complexity, and then see what happens. Just like with my previous experiment studying from the Trennington Brothers, also link below, I'll be using only the original illustrations as a reference. I won't bring anything in from outside, and I'll draw whatever it comes out the first try. No redrawing if it looks bad. Okay, this is gonna be fun. But before we jump in, if you're interested in learning more about this technique, I put together a full course on it. Right now you can get it bundled with 13 of my other courses, over 70 hours of tutorials on character design, background design, and game art. Most of it is focused on illustration with Inkscape, but if you are just into drawing, there is still plenty there for you. Link in the description. First, the cartoon. I wanted something relatively complicated to show how my system breaks down complex images into something manageable. A lot of modern cartoons use super stylized shape where the beauty comes from the colors and composition, which is not bad at all. In fact, it's complex and difficult to do on its own, but this tutorial is all about drawing, so I needed something a bit more detailed. While browsing one of my favorite sites for reference, the Concept Art blog, seriously check it out if you love production artwork, I stumbled across a few pre-production illustrations from the cartoon show Tangled. These drawings were made by the artist Chris Sturgiotis, and I immediately fell in love with the art style. I particularly love the city ones, with the medieval European architecture, the broken ships turned into houses, and the idea of a dried-up port city turned into a shantytown. Really interesting concept that makes me want to watch the show. For this project I handpicked these 5 images to study. It's not a huge batch, but it doesn't have to be for our purposes. The first and most important step of my explorative copy system is deconstruction. If we want to draw something like these backgrounds, we need to understand how they are built. We are using a 2-step process. First, identify the large compositional shapes, and then break down the smaller shapes inside. This will make more sense in a minute. First, the compositional shapes. I started by tracing the large, simple 2D shapes that organize the entire scene. No details yet, just the big building blocks. Here are a few tips for finding and identifying those big compositional shapes. These type of shapes are always 2D shapes, not 3D forms or perspective. Here, these houses are obviously in perspective and have depth and all, but we don't care about that in this stage. We just need a 2D contour. Group smaller elements together if they function as one shape in the composition. In this example, all these boxes and barrels are really close together, so they read as a single shape. Use simple shading, like hatching, to separate overlapping shapes visually, especially if it's too busy like in here. Mark the area of the drawing with a rectangle and the horizon line. I find it somehow useful to get the balance of the shapes, plus it's gonna be important for later steps. It's tempting to overtrace at this stage, but remember that we only care about the abstract layout right now. The end result of your tracing should be a few big shapes that work nicely together, overlapping and creating depth in a clear and easy to read way, even as an abstract collection of shapes. Here's what my deconstructed versions of the 5 backgrounds looks like. But that was the abstract composition. Now we want to indicate what's inside of it, to prepare ourselves for the next step, which will be the actual sketch. The goal is to trace the shapes of the actual objects inside of the illustration, but not the final line art yet. we are looking for the rough 3D forms. For example, in the composition stage, these groups of boxes were simplified into a single big 2D shape. Now I want to go in and roughly block out each box as a cube, or a cylinder in case of the barrels. The same with the houses, the walls, and anything that was inside of one of the compositional shapes from the previous step. Pretty much everything can be broken down into cubes, cylinders, or pyramids. This is why I suggested marking the horizon line early on. It's really helpful to double check if these forms are in the correct perspective. Another important thing, at this stage I think it's also helpful to start making big surface details like cracks, patches, or flags, even if they don't have 3D volume. If they're important for the illustration, it goes on this step. Remember, the next step will be making the line art. I will need these important shapes as a guide. In my Explorative Copy video, I identified these steps as layers, with each layer building on top of the previous layer and introducing more information from the original illustration. We start with the abstract composition, the most general layer with the least information, but the most important structurally. Move on to the internal contents, adding information regarding what's inside of those shapes, and eventually end up with the final layer, which is the line art. That builds on top of that. Here I'm using 2 layers before getting to the line art, but there is no limit on the amount of layers you could add. For example, there are some areas where I just blocked out a couple of shapes. Even though the original drawing had more complex stuff going on, I could have added another layer that builds from this layer and matches more closely that area. That would have definitely made that area much easier and more accurate to copy, but I decided it wasn't worth the time. With 2 layers is more than enough for me. And here are all 5 images after adding this layer. With these 2 layers combined, you can already see something that feels very close to the original, but without getting bothered by the details. This is gonna be important in a moment. Now it's time to make a full line art copy of one of those backgrounds, using the layers we built as a guide for extra accuracy. The idea here isn't to make a perfect reproduction, the idea is to learn from the copying. By copying carefully, you force your brain to memorize the shapes, the composition, and the forms. In my opinion, that's the best foolproof way to learn to draw something. And having the layers underneath not only makes it a lot easier to copy, but also helps you mentally organize all the clutter in there, which is a large part of why we deconstruct the reference, to better understand it. Just like last time when I copied work from the Etherington brothers, I went into this kind of blind. I never studied or copied something like this before. This was my first attempt, and after that Etherington brothers study, this looks easy in comparison, to the point I don't feel the need to copy all 5 backgrounds. With this one I think it's enough for me. In my experience, you have made enough studies when you no longer feel intimidated by what you'd like to replicate. The moment you say to yourself, I could make something like that, you're ready to try. Chances are that you're not gonna be able to draw at that level. It is very different to copy something than to draw from imagination, but at least you're ready to give it a good try and be informed enough on the subject to learn from your mistakes. And it's not like this study took that much time. It was only 1 hour in total, which is nothing in the long term. Looking at it now, I could have spent a few more hours finishing the rest of the drawings and fill my head with even more references, but I didn't like the idea of being over-prepared for the next step, if that makes sense. Anyway, this is the end result. But the next step is where the real challenge comes in. We're going to use everything we learned when we deconstructed our references to start building our very own illustration. Starting with the thumbnails, I don't think I need to go over what thumbnails are or why I'm doing more than one. That's pretty standard. What I'm doing here is looking at the deconstruction shapes we traced earlier and try to draw something similar to that. Something that matches the feel and the style of the original. So for the very first layer, the compositional shapes, I'm drawing simple 2D shapes. And for the second layer, I'm adding more 3-dimensional forms. A quick note here. Personally, I find that I draw better layers when I have perspective lines as a guide, so I'm using the perspective tool in Krita, which is awesome by the way, and works great with this kind of thing. I just wanted to warn you, that's why you see these faint lines across the document. And honestly, you can already tell that I'm more of a beginner artist, because even at this first layer, just with the simple shapes, you can see how the artist's original shapes are way more elegant. They just work together better. They communicate an idea clearly and with less complexity than mine's. Reflecting a bit more on this experiment, especially this part, I think my main problem is that I just lack a clear vision of what I want. That's always been an issue for me. When I'm making thumbnails, I tend to just throw down random shapes and then hope an idea pops up out of nowhere. That's a huge lesson I'm taking from this experiment. I need to improve my thumbnailing skills. That said, all in all, I'm actually happy with what I managed to come up with. I think almost all of the thumbnails look okay, even if they mostly lack that strong sense of direction that the reference had. I ended up choosing this one in particular to move forward because it felt like it had the most meaning behind it. It felt like it was about something, especially about this tent. So I moved on with it to the next step, which is the line art. Now I've got the actual final reference here at the side. Not a deconstruction or something of my own, the final references with the final line art. And I'm going to start to make the line art in my own background with help from the reference. I'm going to repeat what I said when I did the Tangled Brothers copy. When you spend 1 or 2 hours copying something, you memorize the subject. At least a little bit. In my case, I felt like I memorized some of the main objects from the study I did earlier, but for others, I still had to rely on the reference at the side. However, that side reference becomes so much easier to understand once you have done even a single study of the subject. It's way easier to draw and get certain details right. The time spent making a copy of a reference is never wasted in my opinion. And immediately I started off on the wrong foot. I don't know if I placed the perspective guide incorrectly or if I messed up the thumbnail, but the perspective here is completely wrong. I didn't even notice until I was almost finished. You can tell the tent looks really off compared with the buildings behind it. Later on I tried to fix it, but even now I'm not happy with how it turned out. Honestly, I don't know what happened. I had the perspective guide on and everything. I feel it was harder to get it wrong than to get it right. Now, let me just tell you right away the main problem I had with this drawing, and something important I learned from this experiment. Some things from the reference you can adapt into something new pretty easily, like the boxes or the buildings. You can invent new, unique buildings without much trouble. But for other things, when you change the context, you sort of run out of reference material. And that is exactly what happened with the tent, which was supposed to be the focal point. I tried to use what was already in the reference, but it wasn't what I needed. For example, I didn't have a clear reference for how this type of improvised tent looked specifically in the back. So I just made it up and of course it looks bad. Just like with the Tangled Brothers copy, I deliberately decided not to search for extra references because I wanted to study purely from these illustrations. But honestly, I'm starting to think that was a dumb idea. If I had looked for more references for the composition, the buildings, and especially the tent, I feel like the end result would have been so much better. I'm starting to think that from now on, I should use the cartoon references mainly for compositions, cartoon layers, and exaggeration, but rely on real-life reference for the actual subjects, or at least to inform how to draw them. So, yeah, I'm dropping that limitation in the future. I don't care anymore about making pure studies. From now on, I'm bringing in as much reference as I need. It's impossible for me not to see all the mistakes in the composition. Beside the perspective flaw I mentioned earlier, I still think the composition overall could have been stronger, even though for the most part I was satisfied. That's another place where checking out some real-world references, like photos of shanty towns or cinematic shots of European towns, could have really helped me. It would have at least given me some ideas, instead of what I ended up doing, which was basically just throwing some shapes down and hoping for the best. I'm also not fully satisfied with the buildings themselves. Since I didn't search for reference, I had to invent things based only on the few illustrations I had, and often that's just not enough to make a building feel believable. So again, the same problem, lack of reference. It was around these two buildings in the back where I finally noticed the perspective was off, and I quickly fixed using Krita's awesome adjustment tools. I honestly adore Krita. I can't recommend it enough. In fact, I would probably recommend it over Photoshop for illustration work, since it's more focused on drawing. The tools just feel more natural and fitting for illustration for me. And we're getting close to the end here. Even though I wouldn't call this a finished illustration, to me it's more like a sketch, I would definitely give it another pass to clean the line art, redraw some areas and fix some of the mistakes I mentioned earlier. Still, I wouldn't say I'm satisfied with the end result this time. There are some serious flaws, especially in the most important part of the piece, the focal point where the tent is. Plus, it just doesn't feel like the back alley in a shanty town that I was aiming for. And what's even more frustrating, at least for me, is that I know I can do better. I honestly feel that if I grab some proper reference, even just a few, I could fix the focal point, improve some important areas, and make the buildings much more believable. But I'm not going to fix it now. I want to stay true to the experiment and show you exactly what came out on the first try. And looking at it from that point of view, from the original question of whether the explorative technique works on full illustrations, I think the answer is absolutely yes. I learned a lot from doing this copy and then playing around with what I learned, even if it was a single one. Honestly, I think the results would have been even better if I had made more copies instead of just one, and made more illustrations, and if I hadn't restricted myself so much when it comes to using extra reference while drawing something new. So yes, I would definitely recommend this study system if you want to get better at drawing cartoon backgrounds. So that was it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from my failures and occasional success. Don't forget to like and subscribe and let me know what you thought about it in the comments. Also check out the bundle in the description below. That's all for now, see you in the next one. Bye.